A Clergyman's Daughter is a very non-recognizable Orwellian novel. Unlike the other famous Brotherhood novels like 1984 and Animal Farm, this one did not get the recognition it deserved, due to it being, as mentioned by Orwell, as an experimental novel, and it was just writing practice that he didn't want to publish, but he had to in order to secure some income. Evidentially, the work of art was written by the author in 1935. The novel was inspired by Orwell's return to Southwold, Suffolk, his parents' home in the year 1929, where he lived and worked there for 5 years. A lot of characters from the novel are imagery reintroduced by Orwell. He also picked the homelessness and the stranded living style from the experience as a homeless individual in both the streets of Paris and London. This added up a whole new layer to the story that made it a lot more vibrant. However, the narrator hated the novel and didn't want more copies of it printed after his death. The opening of the book is quite depressing, as it shows the setting in which the main character, 28 years old, Dorothy Hare, wakes up. This is the first awakening of her in the book, and it is foreshadowing to another event in the story. Dorothy wakes up tired and tries to get along with her morning, helping her father, Charles Eyre, the rector of St. Athelstan's Church in Knipe Hill. Dorothy worked as an unpaid curate in the church for her father by doing his job of visiting the sick, taking care of the household, and typing up his sermons. Dorothy symbolizes the good and the obedient daughter that came with the Victorian era and that kept existing during the era of the Great Depression. Her father was in deep debts, and he couldn't pay his debts and was neglecting his daughter and his household affairs. This is due to him blaming Dorothy for the death of his wife, as she died, giving birth to Dorothy, as well as him being strict and unsympathetic. This highlights the distance between Dorothy and her father. Mistreated and heavily burdened by the responsibility, Dorothy goes on with her day at Knipe Hill. She rides her bike from place to place, running errands, dodging old shops, and avoiding scandalous stories that goes around the village, told by Mrs. Simpro, a matron who liked to gossip and spread scandals in Knipe Hill. Later on, Dorothy shows up in the cottage near the village, where she helps Mrs. Pyther, a cloth weaver, with her ailments by giving her rheumatism tea, getting buckets of water from the well, and massaging Mrs. Pyther's legs, which Dorothy hated so much, but had to do it for the sake of the church. Mrs. Pyther then asks Dorothy if she believes in heaven, and Dorothy hesitates to answer at first, and then presumes to agree. This hesitation symbolizes the other non-religious part of Dorothy, that is a nihilist and does not care about the world, nor what is happening, which shows dualism in the character of Dorothy. Dorothy leaves the cottage and finds her way to the town again. She reaches town and locks eyes with Mr. Warburton, a famous, rich, and highly promiscuous middle-aged man who was a topic of scandal that involved him and his bastard children. Nevertheless, Warburton was friends with Dorothy and had invited her before to his mansion and initiated to seduce Dorothy, which she stormed out of the mansion and never returned. Warburton had the guts to ask Dorothy for dinner again. He was the sort of man who had nothing to be ashamed of. Dorothy accepts his invitation and shows up hours later to his house. Immediately after that, Warburton gets into questioning existence itself with Anglican Dorothy, who sensed a bit of blasphemy from him. And then he asks her if she still believes in God. And of course she said yes. Then he started laughing at her for being religious. In this case, the character Warburton symbolizes ideology shifts during the period of the Great Depression, as individuals became more extremist towards the idea of God and creation as two far ends, one with devotion, the other with absolute denial, and it is also a juxtaposition that shows two contradictory elements in the plot, Dorothy felt a bit drawn to what Warburton was saying, and then she snapped back to her senses and excused herself out of Warburton's house. As Dorothy went out, someone was creeping, watching from the other side of the neighborhood. Untold by the narrator, Warburton says farewell to Dorothy as she goes back to the church. At the same day, following a particularly hard day at work, by making costumes for children's play at the church school, Dorothy gets some sort of pain in her head, which she manages to tolerate further and through the night, as she had to complete all costumes at once. This act of resistance and tolerance is a representative of individuals' struggle, especially women, in the time of the Great Depression. The Second Awakening comes and Dorothy now finds herself pinned on the floor, looking at the sky. She woke up, but where and wait, what is that? Who is she? She had lost her memory. Amnesia went by and had wiped everything from Dorothy's memory. She found herself in London, at Old Kent Road, unaware of her situation. How she got from Suffolk to London was never explained by the narrator, as he kept it as a mysterious atmosphere to the narrative. Dorothy, flabbergasted by her situation, gets interrupted by a young group of beggars asking her for money. They ask for her name, but she tells them that she didn't remember who she was. The amnesia represents how Dorothy wanted to quit her life so hard and wanted to change and forget that she ever existed as herself. This freedom was obscure. She couldn't think to herself nor do things her way. She always had to follow orders and do things routinely every day, non-stop. The leader of the beggars, named Nobby, a red-haired young fella around the age of our protagonist, introduces himself and his two other followers and convinces her to join their group to go hop-picking in Kent. This event alludes to a biblical verse referred to as the lost sheep, meaning that she is exposed to harm and cannot find the way home. Along the road, the gang of beggars start to split. Before reaching Kent, only Nobby stays with Dorothy. They were divided due to a lack of food as they were leaving the city behind them. Eventually, Dorothy and Nobby reach the hop farms and they manage to secure a place where they can work, eat, and sleep. They do not get paid, as hop picking does not pay very well and it is seasonal. Fall comes and Dorothy and Nobby are still hop picking, but at the end of the season, food becomes scarce. So Nobby had to steal from a farm that had fruit trees close to where they were hop picking. One day he got caught. At the same day, Dorothy had gotten her memory back, not randomly of course, but she was reading the header of the newspaper and her name and her father's were mentioned in the article. This triggered her memory back and she instantly remembered who she was. When she had figured it out, she ran to her friend to tell him, only to find him getting arrested for theft. The feeling of loneliness had drowned Dorothy. Now she must be discreet of her identity, as the article from before was a scandalous lie told by Mrs. Simprel, whom saw Dorothy leaving Warburton's house at night and had nothing but lies to tell about it. Dorothy tried contacting her father using the name of their servant, a woman named Ellen Milborough. She took that name and sent letters to her father. Of course, no reply came, and she thought that her father had abandoned her and that she escaped with Warburton. So Dorothy, now Ellen, gathered her things and whatever money she had left and went back to London. She tries to find a job as Ellen Milborough, but she gets rejected every time in whatever place she goes to. This was explained in the story as her looking like a decent girl, but had no one recommend her for the job, so this rose suspicion in every place she went to, and no one wanted to hire her. This shows how thinking pattern of the early 20th century was regressive in majority of the population. Ellen is slowly running out of money as she is staying in a cheap room in a brothel, and also eating close to nothing, she slowly starts losing hope of making it in the city. After a couple of days, she spends the night outside in Trafalgar Square, as she couldn't go back to the cheap brothel she was staying at and had no intention to go back there anyway. The setting in the square is gloomy and cold, as Dorothy was starving and couldn't eat a thing. She meets a group of tramps in the square. These homeless individuals keep her company, and they tell her stories about their misadventures with homelessness and how they spent nights in parks without getting noticed by the police and how they beg on the streets. This is an allusion to a novel written by the author himself called Down and Out in Paris and London, where Orwell tells his stories of how he lived like a homeless in both cities. The tramps use a dialect. This dialect is highlighted throughout the book and during the conversation between Dorothy and the tramps of Trafalgar Square. This dialect shows the educational difference between both sides, and it showcases reality outside of the secure bubble that Dorothy used to be in her hometown. Our heroine falls asleep mid-conversation with the tramps on the cold night because of fatigue and malnutrition. Dorothy gets up and realizes that she was sleeping inside of a pile of homeless individuals to keep warm. It was dawn. The tramps started moving and Dorothy followed up. She had nowhere and no one to go to, so she had to embrace a life of begging on the streets of London to survive. 1 month had passed since she had involved in the homeless life. Dorothy now is a beggar. She asks for money for the sake of surviving just another day. At the same day, we see her getting involved in an assault. She asks a woman for money, but she ignores her. Dorothy, in a state of hunger and not knowing what is happening, grabs the woman and attacks her. Then police officers show up and Dorothy goes straight to custody and then jail. From the other end, the writer reveals the anxiety of Charles Eyre after his daughter's disappearance. He actually made loads of efforts to reach onto her, but he could not make it as she left no address nor where she was going. The idea of Dorothy escaping with Warburton kept on creeping in Charles' mind, and he kept wondering when he ever wronged Dorothy and why would she do such an action against him. The father had no other solution but to reach on to his cousin Sir Thomas Eyre, an aristocratic, bizarre individual with loads of money under his bed. Charles hated the idea of contacting his cousin because he could not stand him, but he had no other alternative besides asking him to find Dorothy for him. Thomas Eyre accepts, not for love or his good relationship with Charles, but to quiet down all the articles talking about the clergyman's daughter scandal. He did not want his family name to keep on appearing in a news article. Thomas sends on his faithful butler, a grim, quiet, and highly disciplined man, to find Dorothy in London. We get a scene of Dorothy in prison sitting on the floor due to fatigue when the butler shows up and bails her out of there. How did he find her was through the letters that she sent to her father from Kent by the name of Ellen Milborough. That made them figure out where she was. The nearest big city to Kent was London, so she had to be there, and she also did send a letter from London, which made it more obvious. Dorothy, now out of prison, goes to Sir Thomas' manor. Not knowing what is happening, she enters the house and talks to Thomas. He explains everything to her and tells her that her father is the one who asked him to find her, and now that she is here, she can rest and eat. Dorothy instantly agreed since she had no other option. Dorothy stayed at the manor for 3 days until Thomas got her a job as a substitute teacher in London, which she argues that she knows nothing about teaching and that she cannot teach. But Thomas does not want to get bothered by her lack of skill in teaching. He just sends her there and tells her that she will figure it out. And indeed, we saw what Dorothy did before. She technically adapted to every single situation she was in. The next day, Dorothy showed up to Mrs. Min's day school for girls located in London, a girl-only school run by Mrs. Creevy, a severe old lady that is the headmistress of the school. Her name is an intended pun. Mrs. Creepy because of her creepy ways of dealing with people. Dorothy, still using the name Ellen as her identity, shows up to Mrs. Creevy's office. The old woman tells her that she needs to follow her rules and her ways since she is now under her supervision. Ellen agreed to the conditions and was taken to a room that used to be the room of the previous teacher. The room was dark, eerie, and had no natural light coming into it, although there was a window. Ellen couldn't complain as this was far better than sleeping outside on a park bench. The next morning, Dorothy gets prepared for her first day of teaching. She joins Mrs. Creevy to breakfast. In breakfast, Dorothy sees a little bit of Mrs. Creevy, bitter, greedy personality. In the table, there was a plate that had marmalade in it. When Dorothy tried having some, she immediately guarded it with her left arm. Dorothy went on with her day anxious from the post that she had under her responsibility simply because she never had any experience with teaching. When she had reached class, it turned out that the girls or the students were not the same age. They were a class of girls aged from 7 to 16 years old, which was odd at first. And then when Dorothy asked them some questions about history and literature, they were oblivious to any information she had gave them. Some of the details were even different from the original. This shocked Dorothy as she did not understand why private school girls knew nothing about the world they were studying after all. When Dorothy, in this case, Miss Ellen Milborough, had asked the girls about the books they were studying from, they said that they only had one textbook that the teacher was using to dictate from as a form of writing practice. After all that the girls did in that school was sing religious songs, pray, writing practice, and read poems to impress their parents at home. Dorothy figured out that these girls were taught nothing useful, as this was a trick by Mrs. Creevy, who saw the parents of the girls as just a source of income and not humans. This highlights the ruthless reality in the era of the Great Depression. The girls grew in the eyes of Dorothy. She was upset that they were learning nothing, so she had a plan to start to actually teach them everything they were missing. She got new textbooks, and throughout several weeks, the girls started to get better. The thing that got Dorothy into trouble was literature, specifically Shakespeare. The girls, when they went home, they told their parents what they were learning. The parents showed up to Mrs. Creevy's office and were angry at her. She had to channel that anger towards something else or she would lose a lot of clients. So she called Miss Milborough and gave her the talk with the parents there. When the parents had finally left, Mrs. Creevy was telling her that she did not want any of the parents leaving her school and ordered Dorothy to go back to teaching in the old manner, which Dorothy refused at first, but then had to do it in order to not get kicked out from the school and back to the streets. Months had passed and Dorothy grew thinner from low caloric intake in Mrs. Creevy's empty kitchen. The only thing that saved Dorothy was a bar of chocolate that she hid from Creevy so that she does not cut her wage even lower. A day comes and Dorothy gets called to Mrs. Creevy's office. Mrs. Creevy tells her that she does not want her working here anymore. She had hired a lower wage teacher that could work more for less. After all, the headmistress was running a business and had no interest in teaching girls. Dorothy gets angry, packs her things, and leaves the school. Immediately after she leaves, she gets a telegram from an unknown sender. The telegram says that her father wants her to come back home. After that, a taxi cab shows up with Mr. Warburton, who tells Dorothy to get in. He managed to convince her father he was not involved in her disappearance. Warburton left with Dorothy to the train station. They were taking a train back to Suffolk. In the train, a conversation between Dorothy and Warburton sparked. Dorothy tells about her beastly trip of hers. Warburton goes on with his questions with Dorothy. They get into an argument, the same one they had last time in his house. This is a refrain to the idea of the existence of God, which the author mentions a lot in this novel. At the end of the argument, Warburton asks Dorothy to marry him, but she refuses it, as she tells him that she cannot love someone like him, and they don't talk for the rest of the trip. Dorothy finally arrives home, but very different at this time. She changed from the naive girl that knew nothing about the world to a more mature woman. Her father meets up with her. He is glad that she came back home. She tells him what happens. He believes her with a slight suspicion that she still ran away on purpose, and in the final scene, we see Dorothy at the altar praying.